One of the most decisive times in our lives is when we recognize that we need something beyond ourselves. That admission is what it took to turn Tracy Bailey around. Bailey writes that in 1993 he stood in the White House Rose Garden in the presence of the President of the United States to receive the National Teacher of the Year award. He had come a long way. Some 15 years earlier, he had stood as a teenager in the presence of a county judge in an Indiana courtroom to be sentenced to jail. Bailey had gone on a drunken rampage with friends, vandalizing a high school, and had been caught and found guilty. Nevertheless, Bailey stood before the judge with his head held high, with the words of his high school wrestling coach ringing in his ears. "Don't you ever hang your head," his coach had said. "Don't admit defeat. The minute you do, it's over." The judge looked at the proud teenager and stunned the courtroom with Bailey's sentence. 5 years in the Indiana Youth Center, a prison one step below the state penitentiary. Tracy Bailey went to jail with his head still held high, but it only took a few months for reality to set in. One day, as he sat in solitary confinement in his cell with nothing more than a metal cot, a sink, and a toilet, he realized what a mistake he had made with his life. He began to weep. More important, he began to pray. "God, I need your help. I am defeated without you." That was a turning point for Tracy Bailey. He joined a prison Bible study and began taking college correspondence courses. After 14 months in jail, he was released on probation, and after further college studies, he became a science teacher in Florida. With these words, he summarizes the lesson he learned in life. "I bowed my head and tasted victory." Tracy Bailey discovered what his greatest need was. But all of us at some time or another are going to find ourselves in a place where we simply don't have the resources or the wisdom to meet our needs. We need to know what our greatest need is. And that's what we're going to take a look at today in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. What is our greatest need? Now in verses 1 through 4, we're going to see that Jesus often leads his disciples into times of neediness. In verses 5 through 13, we're going to see that even though Jesus leads us into times of neediness, he desires to meet our needs in abundance. And in verses 14 and 15, we're going to answer the question, what is our greatest need? So let's take a look at the passage, John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the people sat down. Now there were about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets of fragments from the barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now in verses 1 through 4, we're going to see that Jesus often leads even his disciples into times of neediness. Now, we may be sometimes surprised that Jesus does so, leads us into place of needing us, but we shouldn't be surprised, as we'll see in verses 1 through 4. Take a look at verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Jesus deliberately took his disciples to a place where there was very little food and no place to buy food. In verses 2 through 4, we're going to see that following Jesus doesn't preclude being needy. Take a look. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Jesus doesn't just allow needs into the lives of unbelievers to help them come to know him. He allows needs to come into the lives of his own disciples. You see, if you find yourself in a place of need, physically, emotionally, spiritually, don't think that you are out of the will of God or that God has somehow made a mistake. Sometimes God leads us, Jesus leads us into places of neediness, but for a purpose, as we will see in verses 5 through 13. In these verses 5 through 13, we're going to see that Jesus' desire is to meet our needs abundantly. Though it may be rather discouraging to hear that Jesus will lead us into places of neediness, it should encourage us to know that he does so that we can learn that he desires to meet those needs abundantly. Let's take a look at verses 5 through 9. Here we're going to see that men just don't have the resources to meet all of their needs. Take a look. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus turns to Philip and asks him where they are to buy bread so that the crowd can eat. Now notice that Jesus recognizes the needs of the crowd and of the disciples, just as he knows your needs. Jesus doesn't need to be told about your need. He knows about them. Jesus recognizes the need of the people just as he recognizes ours. We are specifically told then that Jesus was going to test Philip. He already knew what he was going to do, but he's going to test Philip and the rest of the disciples. What exactly was the test that Jesus was giving the disciples? The answer is that he wanted them to know 2 things. 1, that they could not possibly meet the needs of themselves and the crowd, and 2, that he was capable of doing both. Philip recognizes that they don't have the means, humanly speaking, to meet the needs of themselves and the crowd, for after some quick calculation, he estimates that it will take 8 months' salary. For a denarius was about a day's wage to feed all of these people. They didn't have that much money, and it was impossible for them to raise that amount of money before the need became critical. But as hopeless as the need appeared, they had something more important than money or food. They had Jesus, the Son of God, who had created the world with a word out of nothing. It would be a simple thing for Jesus to provide food for the crowd. Jesus was the answer to their dilemma. Whatever need you may have, even if it is impossible for you to meet it yourself, Jesus has promised to meet your need. If you are willing to do his will, there is a condition. Take a look at Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things, and these things refers to physical needs, will be added to you. Jesus is saying that if you are willing to acknowledge his lordship and submit to his will, he will meet these things, the needs that you have. The test of your faith, as it was for the disciples, was to believe that Jesus can do what is humanly impossible. But Jesus, it is important to notice, did not create food out of nothing, as he had created the world, as we will see in verses 9 through 11. Jesus wants us to cooperate with him in meeting the needs of the people around us by offering our meager gifts to him so he can multiply them. Let's take a look at verses 9 through 11. Andrew says, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. Andrew approaches Jesus hesitantly with an observation. I believe that Andrew really wants to believe that Jesus can do something with this meager offering, but he's not sure, either that Jesus can or that he will turn this meager offering into something that can provide for the needs of everyone. In fact, Andrew has found a boy that has brought his own lunch, 2 dried fish and 5 barley loaves, and though he is reluctant to suggest that Jesus can use this boy's lunch, he still has the faith and the boldness to bring it to Jesus. One has to admire Andrew for that boldness, for he says, "What are these among so many?" Imagine with me, though, the plight of the little boy who had brought his lunch. He could eat even if no one else could, but Andrew's asking him to give up his lunch so that Jesus can do the impossible with his lunch. He may lose his lunch and get nothing in return. He has to have faith that Jesus can take his meager offering and turn it into something that would feed not only him, but everyone else. Just like we have to trust Jesus when we give up our money or our time or our possessions to meet the needs of others. Like the boy, we may think that our meager abilities and possessions couldn't possibly meet the needs of the crowds. But as we will see in verses 12 and 13, Jesus is able to take our meager gifts and turn them into abundance. So let's take a look at verses 12 through 13. "And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost.' So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten." If the boy had not offered up his lunch and Andrew had failed to bring the lunch to Jesus, I believe Jesus would still have met the needs. But Andrew and the boy would have lost the opportunity to cooperate with Jesus in meeting their needs. Jesus wants us to offer what we have to him so that he can multiply them. But if we don't do that, we are the ones who lose. Notice that Jesus takes the meager gift and makes it into something of abundance that meets the needs of the entire crowd. But it doesn't just meet the needs, for the disciples take up 12 baskets of leftovers. Now, you may be asking yourself, where did these 12 baskets come from? Well, they were probably baskets that the disciples used to carry around personal possessions. Most likely, the leftovers fed the disciples for the coming days. Jesus doesn't just meet our needs, he meets them abundantly. Jesus has told us in John chapter 10, verse 10, "I have come that they might have life and that they might have it abundantly." There are all kinds of needs that we face, physical, spiritual, emotional needs. So knowing what we have seen in these verses, what would you say is our greatest need? We see the answer in verses 14 and 15. If you polled a number of people about the greatest needs of human beings, you would probably get a number of different responses. But if you look at the Bible, if you look at this story, you will see that our greatest need becomes clear as we take a look at the last 2 verses. Take a look at verses 14 and 15. When the people saw the sign that he had done, he had created all this food, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, the crowd recognizes that Jesus not only has met their need, but he has the power to meet their needs forever. And so they decide that they are going to use Jesus to meet their needs. They're going to make him their king. Now, this is not the way to have your needs met. Jesus will not be used or manipulated. In fact, Jesus refuses to do this. In fact, the only way that Jesus promises to meet our needs is if we meet the condition of Matthew 6:33. If we are willing to acknowledge him as Lord and submit to his will, he promises to add everything that we need to our lives. So what does Jesus do when people do try to use him or manipulate him? Well, we see the answer in the last part of verse 15. Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. You see, when we think that we can force Jesus to meet our needs or use him or manipulate him to get what we want, he will not be used or manipulated. He will withdraw from us if we try to force him. However, if we are willing to acknowledge him as Lord and submit to his will, he promises to meet every need that we have. So what is our greatest need? We need Jesus. We need him for salvation from God's condemnation, and we need him when we can't possibly meet our physical, emotional, spiritual needs. Jesus is our greatest need. When we have a relationship with Jesus and we are fellowshipping with him, we have everything that we need. But Jesus only meets our need when we are willing to acknowledge him as Lord and submit to his will. Now, how do we apply these verses? Number one, we need to admit that we do not have the resources to meet all of our needs. We need to recognize that we are needy people. Two, we need to recognize that our greatest need is a relationship with Jesus Christ. And three, we must not ever think that we can manipulate or use Jesus. We can only have our needs met when we submit to his will. Author and speaker Jill Briscoe wrote, "I had been traveling for 2 weeks straight speaking at meetings. Somehow the tight schedule had allowed only time for talking and not much for eating. Whenever it was mealtime, I found myself on another airplane. On this particular day, it was hot, it was summer, and I was tired and hungry. My flight had been delayed, and by the time I arrived at the next conference center, I discovered that my hosts had gone to bed. I wandered around a large dining room, hoping to find something to eat, but all the doors to the kitchen had been locked. Lord, I prayed, I really don't care what I eat, but I need something. And while I'm at it, I've got a yearning for peaches. Oh, for lovely, refreshing, juicy peaches." Then I smiled. That was just the sort of prayer I counseled others against offering to God. I sighed, picked up my bags, and went to my assigned room. When I arrived at my room, I found a basket of peaches smiling at the doorstep, smiling up at me. The Lord, with a sweet touch, had reminded me of his love for me. You see, the Lord meets our needs when we submit to him because he loves us.